Alright, it's Stella here, and this is my project for period 5. So we start out with the Northwest, weapons, more battles. Before you know it, the West is a kind of a mess. And it's kind of a big deal. You know, it's a civil war, meaning that it's within our country. There wasn't foreign involvement, really. It was just the breaking up of our country. So we come from the 13 colonies, don't tread on me, and it's all split up. Lincoln's all like, please don't split me up, because we want to have a union. We want to be united. And so Lincoln's like, hey, let's get back together, let's get back into this union, civil war is over, but they kill him. So that kind of backfired a little bit. So instead, here we have the new president, which is Andrew Johnson, and I almost said Jackson, but it's Andrew Johnson. He was Lincoln's vice president, but now he's the president. And he's a bit interesting. He's probably the grumpiest president ever, most likely, because in all of his pictures, he looks like... Yeah. So, to get back together, Lincoln came up with the 10% plan, which is basically, the plan is that states could be readmitted if 10% of the voters in 1860, there was an election, if they pledged loyalty to the Union and if they passed the 13th Amendment. And since Lincoln was out of the picture now, Johnson just adopted the 10% plan, basically. And it had two parts. And one was the benefit for the Confederates, which is basically they would be pardoned. And then I already told you the second one, that they can be admitted with the 10% of the voters. But it was infirmed that they had to pass the 13th Amendment. So that was the deal. And so they snuck that in there. Not really. And unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, since he actually kind of broke the law, Johnson is impeached. He didn't actually get kicked out of office, so I guess he technically wasn't impeached. So that's probably the only time he was happy. Here's the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. So the 13th is what they were what they were told to pass, and it's basically that slavery is banned. Next up is the 14th Amendment, which basically gained citizenship for all those born in the U.S., and it made the Act of 1866 permanent. So that was great. And then the 15th Amendment happened, and that was the suffrage amendment. And it said that suffrage can't be denied based on race, color, or past enslavement status. And that would help ensure that there was Republican support in the South, because the different voters that would be able to vote to get Union help, and that came a lot from blacks and past slaves. So now we have the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food and education, right? And what else? And assistance to former slaves and poor whites. But its biggest success was in education. So, go you, education. Next, we have women's suffrage, which is denied. Again, surprise. So, most men oppose women's suffrage, which is normal, but what was not normal is that the women's rights group was actually split. Lucy Stone and the American Women's Suffrage Association wanted suffrage after Reconstruction. However, Stanton feared that suffrage was not near enough and that they needed to spend their advocacy and their funds on something else. That she didn't feel like it was worth it. She felt like it was more of a lost cause at the moment. So it was actually quite a conflict, and it was kind of surprising at the time. So it was almost in a standoff, not necessarily between the two, but there was nothing getting done for women's suffrage. So after that, we get to wage labor and sharecropping. So once slavery was banned, that meant that they couldn't, that plantation owners couldn't have slaves and not pay them or provide for them in some way to reimburse what they were working on. And so basically the plantation owners didn't want to do this. They didn't want to have to pay money to their slaves. And so they came up with a system for crops. And that crops would be their money. It was a different kind of green. So yeah. But crops meant good for those tenants, and basically that was their payments to the tenant owners, landowners, and so many former slaves had to work for their former slave owners because there was no land available. So basically they would rent their land, or tenant owners, and they would pay with the crops that they harvest. Then there was also crop lien, and that was when you took credit out from a local store at a very high rate for interest, and that usually led to debt, but that meant that food became money for these people. But what happened is, if you had a good crop year and you exchanged that, it was great. Sometimes there would be a drought or poor farming, and those tenants would be out of their where they were living and their whole livelihood. So after that happened, on that one note, after that we have the Republican governments in the South, and there's something called the Union League. And basically what it was is it was a league that passed on information for blacks and whites, and basically the Republicans wanted to share political news and how to vote to the voters that would be aiming for them. So especially blacks and poor whites. And so they came up with a way to educate these people on how to vote and political nature, which was great. Now we come to scallywags and carpetbaggers. Scallywags were those that were Southerners that really favored Reconstruction, but not necessarily because they were in support of civil rights. They wanted money, and it was good for the economic business. So you can see in this picture here the distrust from the African American looking towards the rich, pompous white man that is obviously trying to make a deal with him or something like that. But a carpetbagger was one that moved to the South from the North during Reconstruction, and they were usually doctors, lawyers, and teachers. So people that were fairly successful in the eyes of those from the South, and they were seen as really, really low people, and they were not very popular. Then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and it claimed to give full and equal access to political accommodations, which, come on, that is absolute bullcrap. That a law can't do that. No, you can't, basically, it failed. Nothing happened because of it. It was an empty promise. It was a good try, I guess. But it didn't work. At all. Moving on. So after that, there were a few scandals with the government. And this was one of them. The Union Pacific Railroad Company, they had what was called credit mobilizer. And this was scary, to be honest, because the government officials accepted bribes to ignore issues that would affect the Union Pacific Railroad's progress in building railroads across the country. This also affected tax evasion, and even the Secretary of State, I think, accepted bribes, and this was a really big scandal, and Grant's administration really suffered because of it whenever it was exposed. For good reasons. That shouldn't be happening. So, as always, money runs the world. So, that's upsetting. Next, we have the counter-revolution in the South, which is basically what Earth loves. Blood. This is where the KKK comes in, and Redeemer governments, which are essentially just governments that are so against Republican governments that they hold violent protests, and that included bloodshed. But the response to the counter-revolution was the Enforcement Acts, which, just as it sounds, it enforced and protected civil rights, or at least it tried, and it was an attempt to try and calm down the problems that were being faced down the South because of this. But then something happened. Democrats took over. But after that, we lead into the political crisis of 1877. And this is where we have, as usual, a Democrat versus Republican. And Tilden had 184 votes, and Hayes has 165, and there were 20 on the verge, and there are 185 necessary in order to win the election, and it's obvious. You look at this even now, and you think, oh, Tilden has it in the bag. He only needs one of those 20. But the 20 choose Hayes, all 20 of them, and this shocks everyone. But it's important because it means that Reconstruction has ended. All the troops are retreated out of the South, and things get back to whatever you call normal for the South. And yeah, so Reconstruction ends. Yay. And that's it. So that's my Period 5 review. Thanks.